I'm Max Keiser. This is the Keiser Report, the show that brings you more news in 26 minutes than the entire network of FMs. What? That's right. Huh?
Max, we're going to talk about strategic scams on this episode of the Keiser Report. And I think these two stories I have here, these two headlines, juxtaposed together, they tell an important story about empire. And it is the shrinking wealth at home, expanding footprint abroad. So first I'm going to look to a story about one of my favorite headlines I've talked about often, and that is the Obamacare. Smart tactic, but sad that Americans need to be so strategic to afford health care. Ann Cornwell considered two drastic strategies in her quest to get affordable health insurance premiums last year for herself and her retired husband. One was divorce, another was taking 30% pay cut. She chose the latter. The maneuver slashed the premiums for the couple who lived in Chattanooga, Tennessee, from exorbitant to economical. Instead of $2,100 a month, the amount she had been quoted for 2017, their premiums are just $87 monthly. Her lost income more than compensated for by qualifying for insurance subsidies. They're seeing this now going into 2018, where premiums are going up again. You know, we've talked about these $2,000 a month premiums, but what Americans are choosing to do is shrink their incomes in order to qualify for the free taxpayer money. Everybody's at the trough of basically fraud and scams and you know, getting some money out of the government is the only way to get wealthy in this sort of economy, an imperial economy.
The American dream is actually the French dream.
Exactly.
You know, we lived in France for many years, and the population spends all their day trying to game the system, game the government, and game the subsidies, and avoid work at all costs. And they call that socialism, but it's just basically lazyism or the exceptionalism that is France, la France. And so America is entering late-stage sclerotic growth of an empire that's in the decline, like France before it. The dollar's losing its status as world reserve currency, and so the population just spends all day trying to nickel and dime each other and the government.
Well, this is what you get as well when you have these sort of wealth and income gaps and opportunity gaps, is that instead of everybody just having a national health service, or the French healthcare system is really good and equal, everybody's treated equal. Here, it's either you are like bled to death, or you're given like world-class healthcare for nothing, for $87 a month. So those are the only two options. So at a certain point, and it made so much sense, it was so obvious to see this coming, is that this couple had $85,000 in income. And that meant she had to pay, that was before taxes, by the way. So that meant they had to pay $2,100 a month. But if she just lowered it to under $65,000 or $62,000, then she just gets it for free. So why go through all that stress of coming up with $2,100 a month, working your bum off in order to get that money to pay that $2,100, and then just sit back? You know, she gets more days off. She could just sit at home, do something else, read books, whatever.
And what's the quid pro quo for people who are happy to pay the maximum in the extortion racket that the drug and insurance companies got the government to impose, that unconstitutional tax called Obamacare, is that they are bought in to America's various foreign policies of rape and pillage for a few bucks. That's the foreign policy. Or to let pharmaceutical companies create an opiate crisis domestically. You don't hear anyone questioning that on MSNBC or CNBC or any of the mainstream media outlets. They all buy into it. They get paid a lot of money. They'll pay the stipend to the health extortionists and the Obamacare folks, as long as they push the line that there's still an active, non-ghost-like population that's crawling around America, fishing through garbage pails, living on $5 a day, entering the third world, and trying to game the system 24/7.
So here you have a situation where people have been incentivized to earn less, to be less, to think less, to strive less in order to get the free health care. Overseas, anybody who's connected in D.C., has connections or close to power, And Erik Prince is one of these guys. Erik Prince is a very good friend of Steve Bannon. His sister is Betsy DeVos, who is the education secretary in the Trump administration. Well, apparently, he pitched a plan to strategically scam the American population and basically plunder Afghanistan, and thus exposing what the plan was all along. Private war. Erik Prince has his eye on Afghanistan's rare metals. Controversial private security tycoon Erik Prince has famously pitched an audacious plan to the Trump administration. Hire him to privatize the war in Afghanistan using squads of security contractors. Now, for the first time, however, BuzzFeed News is publishing that pitch, a presentation that lays out how Prince wanted to take over the war from the U.S. military and how he envisioned mining some of the most war-torn provinces in Afghanistan to help fund security operations and obtain strategic mineral resources for the U.S. One slide, for example, shows that he believes that there's $1 trillion worth of rare earth metals and things like lithium for batteries in just Helmand province. And he wants to go get it. He'll give the U.S. government a cut, and his private contractors, his security, his hitmen, his guys will go in there and take it.
Right, he wants to do a leveraged buyout of Afghanistan. He's pledging the collateral of the rare earths to fund his takeover of the country and to sell off the rare earths and to get a fee on the invasion. Now, Dick Cheney pitched that the invasion of Iraq would pay for itself from the revenues on the oils.
Yeah, I think it was Ahmad Chalabi.
Chalabi.
Yeah.
That's right. And that turned out to be a sinkhole of multi-trillion-dollar catastrophe and a human rights disaster. I'm sure Libya, according to Hillary Clinton, was pitched in a similar way. Get rid of Gaddafi, we'll get the energy resources, we'll do a leveraged buyout of Libya. Greece, it was totally destroyed as a quasi-leveraged buyout between Hank Paulson, or I should say John Paulson, the hedge fund manager, and Lloyd Blankfein at Goldman Sachs to turn that country into some kind of paradise for hedge fund managers. So whenever you have financiers, like in this case Erik Prince, former assassin for hire turned hedge fund manager, to go in and do a leveraged buyout on a country or a company, the results are encroaching oligopoly, human rights catastrophe, and no accountability. This will be a disaster. He'll get rich. There'll be a lot of deaths, a lot of murders, a lot of disease, and that'll be written off and never talked about.
Well, there are new technologies that can basically offer the Afghani people themselves access to that mineral wealth, and that is something like an initial coin offering. They should just, right now, before Erik Prince could sell this, because he is still in D.C. pitching this to all sorts of lawmakers, trying to get him to go in there, his private army, to steal their resources. Well, why don't they just float it and say, hey, here's our initial coin offering. You can have a cut of our $1 trillion in Helmand coin. They should offer it. It's worth $1 trillion. They'll take $500 billion. You come in, extract it, and that's it. They can immediately access that. The global financial crypto markets are desperate for investment opportunities.
We pitched this to Varis Varoufakis,
yes,
who was the finance minister of Greece.
Yeah.
And we told him, go to Bitcoin, make Bitcoin. We talked about this in, 6 years ago.
Yeah, exactly, but Greece only had debt. These guys have no debt, zero debt from Afghanistan, and they've got thousands and trillions of dollars of resources.
Well, Venezuela's going to offer the Petro, which is going to be a crypto coin backed by natural resources.
Yes, you talked about it in the previous episode with our guest from Cuba. But now I want to talk about this, what he's modeling this on. This is quite...
Okay.
Okay. Speaking of imperial, remember I said these imperial nations, you always see a shrinking of the wealth at home, and as the footprint has to expand overseas, and more is dedicated to keeping the edge of empire alive, and people like Erik Prince very wealthy. So Prince briefed top Trump administration officials directly, talked up his plan publicly on the D.C. circuit, and published op-eds about it. He patterned the strategy he is pitching on the historical model of the old British East India Company, which had its own army and colonized much of Britain's empire in India. Quote, an East India Company approach, he wrote in the Wall Street Journal, would use cheaper private solutions to fill the gaps that plague the Afghan security forces, including reliable logistics and aviation support. You go to the Wall Street Journal, you go to Bloomberg, or you go to Financial Times, and you see all of this stuff openly discussed that never gets discussed on the shrieky cable news, which is pushing hoax after hoax after hoax about various social issues. Whereas the empire is being divided up and cut and chopped, all the wealth stolen around the world, and openly in the pages of the financial press.
Yeah, well, of course, the East India Company was a colossal failure and bubble that burst.
It could be the South Sea bubble as well.
Am I confusing the South Sea bubble with the East India Company?
East India Company was very, very successful, and I think it was a successful enterprise.
Was it always a success?
This is a show about modern day, and I'm just comparing Erik Prince, that he's modeling this on a previous empire, how the East India Company helped with their private armies to expand the British Empire. The British Empire, for sure, has collapsed. That is gone. You can say that for sure, that you got that right. Here we have an American empire on the verge of collapse, and here we have a guy, Erik Prince, who's connected to the political powers that be, who wants to expand, who plunder the rest of the nation while the U.S. still is the empire.
Okay. So let's see. The British Empire and the East India Company versus the American Empire and Erik Prince's Neo-East India Company.
Whatever he's calling
the Afghanistani East Company.
Yes. He wants to do it through his Chinese registered company.
As you do.
Yeah, because he knows which is the next empire. This is him transitioning to the next empire, I think. I don't know if he's even allowed to set foot here, but one surprising element is the commercial promises Prince envisions that the U.S. will get access to Afghanistan's rich deposits of minerals such as lithium used in batteries, uranium, magnesite, and rare earth elements, critical metals used in high tech from defense to electronics. One slide estimates the value of mineral deposits in Helmand province alone at $1 trillion. He does mention, actually, even though he's doing it he's proposing this anyway through his Chinese registered company, is that the Chinese manipulate the rare earth elements markets so that giving the U.S. access.
Well, I mean, there's a lot of rare earths on asteroids. Why not put Erik Prince on a rocket, strap him to the rocket, and blast him off into outer space? I think everyone would be. Anyway, we got to go to the break. Don't go away. Much more coming your way. Welcome back to the Keiser Report. I'm Max Keiser. Time now to turn to Marshall Auerback. He's the research associate at the Levy Institute. Marshall, welcome back.
Max, thanks for having me again.
All right, listen, before we get into this deep, ideological stuff, I got to ask you about a tweet talking about the Carolina Hurricanes and the National Hockey League.
Oh, yeah.
What's your thoughts on this?
They should relocate to Quebec City. Sorry, all you hockey fans in Raleigh. I know there's not very many of you, but...
That's my team now. I follow them, and you're talking about reloading them to Quebec. I mean, I'm just getting into the Hurricanes.
You and maybe 5,000 other, judging from the attendance levels at the game, so...
Wow. So this is part of an expansion of the NHL?
Well, no, the whole reason why this came up is because Seattle agreed to spend a pile of money renovating its old arena. So Gary Bettman came out last night and effectively all but promised them an expansion franchise for a cool $650 million. So,
who do you like in the Stanley Cup this year?
Well, I got to stick with the Leafs.
The Leafs? Toronto Maple Leafs?
Of course, that's my team.
That's their team? That's their year? All right,
it's always their year.
All right, let's talk about, we were on recently and people started asking about MMT. They're really into MMT. They want to know more about MMT. You're one of the preeminent MMT people. Tell us about it.
I would describe myself more as a popularizer and propagandist in regard to modern monetary theory. The people really behind it who've done all the heavy lifting are scholars like Bill Mitchell at the University of Newcastle in Australia, Stephanie Kelton, Randy Ray, Jan Kregel, and of course Warren Mosler, who's also got a prominent following in the Twitter sphere.
So tell us a little bit about it. Just give us a primer on it. I'm just going to sit back and let you talk a little bit about it because if people have a real interest in this.
There's a lot of different aspects to it, but the main point that modern monetary theorists always make is that there is no inherent financing constraint when you are a sovereign in your own currency. And by that means you are the issuer of your own currency. You are not operating on an exchange rate standard, a gold standard. You're free to create as much money as is required consistent with broader public purpose. Which is not to say, as Dick Cheney did, that deficits don't matter. What it does mean is that the focus remains on the constraint of real resources. So that if the government keeps spending and willy-nilly...
By real resources, qualify that.
Well, I mean, like if you've got a tight labor market, you've got tight commodity markets, and you keep spending money, then of course you can get inflation. That's your constraint. But there's no necessary constraint on, say, like, the European Union has a Stability and Growth Pact, what Prodi rightly called the Stupidity and Growth Pact, where they say you can't run budget deficits more than 3% of GDP.
So of course, when Greece was entered into the euro, Goldman Sachs helped them cook the books to get around that.
Yeah, but there is no concrete, there's no empirical basis at any level per se.
Okay, who in the government? The function of this would fall to the Treasury, right?
That's correct. That's
not
correct. Well, the central bank and Treasury effectively have a unified function. What happens is that the Treasury spends the money into existence, and the Federal Reserve, as the central bank, effectively acts as the scorekeeper, and it's the guy that is the entity that actually punches in the digits on the keyboard, that creates the money in the first place.
But doesn't this obviate the need for the central bank?
Well, it is. It's a
because the central bank loans the money to the Treasury effectively, right?
Yeah,
at interest, and that's where you end up with a problem because you got to print money to pay the interest, and if you end up with a kind of explosion in money.
Well, but it's like saying you have your mother and your father. They both take on the parenting function. They just take on different roles. So it's,
but the central bank is privately owned, and the federal.
Well, I've heard that argument before, but it is a creature of Congress. It was created by Congress. It could be revoked by Congress.
Congress is not a wholesome beast. It doesn't like that to operate in the best interest of all at all times.
I agree.
This is a privately held bank that is lending money at interest. That is not healthy.
Look, I wouldn't disagree with you.
Ben Franklin said one of the reasons America staged the revolution was to get rid of away from the Bank of England. The Bank of England.
And they, of course, eliminated the Bank of the United States at one point as well. But look, even if you got rid of the Federal Reserve tomorrow and replaced it with something else, that you're not going to eliminate corruption. It looks like Congress is in theory a public institution acting in broader public purpose. But I wouldn't say that what you've seen out of Congress, certainly in regards to, say, this tax bill, is.
Okay, you're saying though they would be proactive in increasing or decreasing availability of money depending on restraints and constraints and taking the temperature of the economy, whereas in the central bank equation, they seem to only see one possible outcome, and that is to keep rates as low as possible, seemingly to kowtow to folks that are benefiting from these low rates, like the leveraged buyouts, people buying back their own shares, people involved in all kinds of nefarious schemes that require low interest rates, and they don't raise rates even though the signs are there to raise rates.
I would question whether there actually are signs of raising rates. I mean, I think there's signs of deterioration in the credit market. There's signs of slowdowns in a lot of different areas. So I'm not sure I would agree with that. But the point is, actually, MMTers would argue that the natural rate of interest is zero, because what happens is when you flood the system full of reserves, inexorably that pushes prices down to interest rates down to zero. And it's only if you have an active agent on the other side, whether that be the central bank actually raising the discount rate or raising interest rates on reserves, that you actually can raise rates.
Let's talk about money velocity. Okay, this is the rate at which money goes from bank to bank to bank to bank to bank, right? Yeah. And in an expanding economy, of course, you have high money velocity, and in a contracting economy, you see low money velocity. Now, since the 2008 crisis, we see the central bank printing records amount of cash and it being hoarded on the balance sheets of banks that are technically insolvent. They're not lending it out. The money velocity is moribund. It's dead because they're bad actors enabled by the central bank. They're keeping the zombie banks afloat, Marshall. That's a problem. How do we deal with that?
Okay, well, that's...
interest rates, let me just finish. So the interest rates are low, not because there's no demand for credit. It's like saying there's millions of small businesses in America, and they don't want to grow. They don't want to hire people. There's no economic growth, and they want to borrow money. But they're not being able to borrow money because the banks are hoarding it on their sheets to keep their insolvent balance sheets afloat.
Well, first of all, they don't lend out reserves. I mean, reserves are there for settlement purposes in the interbank market and also with the other central bank. But look, lending itself is a two-way contract between lender and borrower. So you want to have a borrower who is actually got rising income and is gainfully employed when he takes on a loan.
Wait a minute. The banks, they don't lend out reserves, but their balance sheets are backed by reserves. In other words, they lend out money, but they don't take risks. They're playing games through the primary dealers and with the central banks all the time.
Well,
they keep their exposure to these loans to zero. They don't want to take any frickin' risks. So they have this relationship with the central bank. They're not directly loaning out reserves, but they have a direct connection to the banks. And that's a dead system. And they're keeping these zombie banks alive.
And MMTers have things to say about that as well. Generally speaking, if you read the works of people like Bill Mitchell, for example, he argues that the best thing would be to have a narrow banking model where you effectively preserve the integrity.
It's a utility.
Yeah,
it's not.
Right.
It's not out there making bets.
Yes,
like the Federal Reserve is leveraged 60 to 1.
Yes,
making
that's right.
bets. Okay,
That's
0% interest rates for an MMT Treasury function. It's just getting back to this idea of money as a utility. They're putting it out there. It's 0% because they're not trying to scam on the rate spread. They're just making it either available or not available, right?
And they also would argue that the optimal way to control demand is via fiscal policy rather than through interest rates, because interest rates are I always say it's like using a meat cleaver to conduct surgery. Interest rates have a variable effect because for every person that's hurt by rising interest rates, there's a saver who might be helped by it. So it doesn't have the same kind of effect.
Why steal from savers to give to speculators?
So, for example, when you had this housing bubble in the early 2000s, well, actually it started well before that. But if you had actually introduced real estate taxes, that could have slowed it down, and you wouldn't have needed to use the interest rate weapon. That's just one example.
Okay, who determines whether the economy should be injected with cash or not? You're looking at a matrix of data. You talked about wages. You talked about inflation. All those parameters have been bastardized and distorted over the years because the government doesn't want to recognize inflation, so they do hedonic adjustments to the CPI and other figures to make it look like there is no inflation because they don't want to pay out any kind of cost of living adjustments and these other inflation rates. So who in government would actually be in charge of the data in a real way? The National Data Service? Who's in charge there?
But the actual data, there are many ways to measure the data, and the broader you get on the employment measures, for example, the more accurate a gauge you get for the economy. You're obviously basing your remarks on certain data points that you have seen. For example,
BLS, the Bureau of Labor Statistics.
That's right.
They publish garbage.
No, I think actually the BLS for people, they produce very, very good work.
They keep saying the unemployment rate's going down, but the number of people that are unemployed keeps going up. There's like 95 million people eligible, employment that are not working. It's the highest ever.
And that statistic is underemployment is a big problem. And of course, what you're talking about is the number of people that are actually employed. So yeah, you're right. But that's again based on data that's out there for people to see. So it's really a
Why
question.
do they cherry pick the garbage data?
Well, the government does that, but
why do they do that?
Well, because
they're disingenuous.
Of course they are. But you're asking me you're not going to imply that the theory is responsible for the cherry picking of the garbage. That's what that's like.
I think this theory.
That's like blaming the.
No, the theory is fine in terms of let's look at the money supply and let's treat it as a utility and let's keep interest rates at zero. And before the central bank in America, before 1913, isn't that the way it was operated?
But you were on a gold standard then as well.
And the gold standard, okay, so the gold standard, let's talk about that because that is not in the MMT world. They don't like the gold standard, right?
They do not like any constraint which impinges on the ability of the government to act in a sovereign capacity, is the way that they would phrase it.
Okay.
And the gold standard does not allow you to deal with the exogenous extreme shocks to demand that you had say throughout the 19th century, or like you also had.
What about the constraint of a gold
1930s.
standard versus the artificial constraints that you're putting together there in academic world, saying, so data that we're looking at which could be nonsense, we're going to.
But that's not the academic world. That's political bastardization.
Where do they come
statistics.
from, though? It's the academics and the think tanks and the folks that have an agenda. They infiltrate into the government and they push their screwy data.
You are correct. There are because
you keep saying I'm correct.
Well, because I'm not disputing it.
Because you're wrong about Quebec. You're wrong about the Carolina Hurricanes. This is a pattern, Marshall.
Well, we'll disagree on that. but on the other points, yeah, you're right. Economists often have a political agenda. Okay, and economics is a social science. Many of the biases that people have have in regard to the policy outcomes they want are informed by their politics, which is why you have them often cherry-picking at data or using discredited economic theories, because, like someone like Greg Mankiw still has books to sell.
Yeah, but gold is,
sell.
there's so much gold. Here's the gold, here's the constraint. Now we have to work underneath that constraint. Why not just go with the real constraint instead of relying on someone to come up with an artificial constraint?
Which is exactly what MMTers want to do. Work on the basis of conducting policy on the basis of real constraints rather than artificial
Gold
ones.
is a real constraint.
Yeah, but why do you want to do it on gold? Because
it's worked for 100 years.
In what way did it work? You had 5 depressions in the 19th century. You had the Great Depression in the 1930s. In what way did gold actually work?
Yeah, the whole globalization was built on the gold standard and the gold of the policies between intercountry policies on the gold standard. You had 100 years of growth up until the early 20th century.
You had 5 depressions in the 19th.
How long were they? But you need a depression. It's like capitalism without a depression is like Catholicism without hell. I mean, you're going to have the occasional pullback. That's the way capitalism works. Do you want free market capitalism, or do you want like diaper socialism?
Well, look, I don't disagree that you can have you're going to have depressions or recessions. The question is, do you want to have optimal policy tools to mitigate the impact of that? That's what you really want to do.
No, that's a good question. But we got to go. We got to leave. Thanks for being on the Keiser Report.
It's my pleasure.
All right, well, that's going to
go
do
Leafs.
it. Yeah, the Maple Leafs are going to win. That's the point of this conversation, is that the Toronto Maple Leafs are going to win this Stanley Cup, and there's something called MMT. If you want to catch us on Twitter, it's Keiser Report. Until next time, bye, y'all.